So the last video we left off talking a little bit about the differences between material culture and non-material culture. The last example I brought up was how both language and marriage customs, which are kind of symbolic or normative practices that we have in society, are both examples of non-material culture. One more example of non-material culture are funeral customs or funeral practices in societies. Right? In the United States, typically when someone passes away, we hold our death ritual here is to hold some type of funeral or memorial service. Oftentimes these are connected to religious affiliations or groupings that the person was a part of who passed away. People will come dressing in black. There'll be some sort of ceremony typically. And then oftentimes people in the United States will be buried, right, at a cemetery so they can be visited by others even after they've been passed away. In the Yagua culture, which is again this kind of tribal hunter-gatherer society that we've been comparing United States culture to, they have a very different practice or ritual when someone passes away. When someone dies in Yagua culture, it's largely believed that they were taken over by some sort of evil spirit, and to ensure that that evil entity that claimed the life of that individual doesn't spread to other members of the society, the Yagua culture practice is to burn down the dead person's house and all of their belongings to ensure that that evil spirit that took over them does not go on to take over other members of the society. So again, material culture has to do with the physical things, the physical objects that we assign meaning to within a particular culture, and non-material culture is more to do with a group's shared way of thinking and doing things. So think of the norms or the customs, the behaviors that any given society would have. So symbols and language obviously play a very large part in each society's culture. A symbol, if you remember, we talked a little bit about these when we introduced the sociological theory of symbolic interactionism. Symbols are anything that carry a specific meaning that's recognized by people who share a culture, right? So every society uses symbols to establish shared ways of meaning and communicating with one another, right? In our society, this gesture is a symbol for hello, right? This gesture is a symbol for good job. This gesture is a symbol for, screw off, buzz off, don't want to deal with you, etc. Right? So all those gestures have meaning, but even things like we talked about, like the drawing of a heart, right? That curved red shape that we associate the meaning with heart with, right? That's a symbol for a heart, like we talked about, when in reality, it doesn't really look like a real heart that are covered in veins and slimy looking, right? But it's a symbol of love in our society. Another thing here, right? This red octagon, if you're driving and you see a red octagon posted on the side of the road, that's a symbol for stopping, right? That's a stop sign. When you drive up to a stoplight, if the light is red, that's a symbol to stop. If it's yellow, it's a symbol for slowing down. If it's green, it's a symbol to go, right? Same thing, holding out one's hand like this is a symbol in our society for stop or don't move, stay still, right? Or alternatively, we might use our language, which is a series of words or symbols that we've given meaning to, right? The words don't move or stop or stand still are all symbolic gestures to indicate that we should stop moving or to quit doing whatever it is that we're doing, right? So every society has a system of symbols, and the way we communicate the meaning of those symbols to one another so we can have a collective meaning and a shared sense of meaning is through language. So language is really just a symbolic system through which people communicate and through which culture is transmitted. And if you remember back to last week, right, when we were talking about socialization and self-development, without language, without this shared system to communicate and interact with one another, our species would cease to exist. We are dependent on interaction, and the way we interact with one another to share meanings and symbols with one another is by developing a sense of language. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that the way people understand the world is based on their form of language, or in another way to simply put the conclusion of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that language shapes our reality. Without language, we would cease to understand anything, right? We couldn't make sense of anything in our world. So that's a really powerful tool to sit and reflect on for a moment. The language that we have, the words, the symbols that we have that enable us to communicate, shape our perception of reality. if we wouldn't have a word or a symbol or some way to communicate about a certain object or a certain feeling or a certain interaction in our society, we couldn't make sense of it, right? We couldn't have any sort of intellect. It would be completely unintelligible to us, right? Imagine, all right, if I held this up in front of you, you can see what this is, right? I would ask you, what is this? You would say, this is a phone, right? If I held up this and said, hey, what is this? You'd say, oh, that's a coffee mug, right? Now imagine if I held that object up to you and you didn't have a word for it. If you you didn't know what that was. Maybe in your society, in your culture, that isn't an artifact or an object that you use, right? So how could you make sense of what that is? Well, you couldn't, right? If it's not an object that your society has created a symbol for or has created a language or a word to represent what that object is, it really would cease to exist in your own mind. And that's the basis behind the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is that our language shapes our understanding of the societies that we're in, and it shapes our reality, right? So that's a really drastic example, not having a word for the cell phone or not having a word for a coffee mug. But also consider a more subtle context. The choices we make to describe things, right? Or to assign meanings or labels to people or to groups in our society. And a great example of this is to consider how our language is heavily influenced by gender, right? So think about this. How does using language like fresh man, fireman, or even addressing a group of people as guys affect the way that we view and make sense of gender or people in our society? Well, it really has a lot to say with this reality that our society was built on the premise that the default for everything is men, right? We live in a patriarchal society, which we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks when we unpack the sociology of gender. But you can really see the impacts of patriarchy by looking at the language we use in the English language, right? Specifically, the Americanized version of English language, right? Would we call an entire group of first-year students fresh women the way we call them fresh men? No, of course not in our society. If I walked into a classroom of people of all different genders and said, "What's up, ladies?" would people be offended? Of course. But if I walk into a classroom and say, "Hey guys, how are y'all doing today, guys?" would everyone be offended by that? Not necessarily, not in the same way. So we live in a society that has enabled us to default to men, right? Firemen, policemen, mailmen, chairmen, right? There's so many examples of words in our society that just default to men being the centralized, focused unit. But if we would replace that man phrase with woman, like I said, fresh woman, fire woman, police woman, to refer to all people within that group and not just the women within that group, the men in that group would become very offended, right? In our society that relies on this binary understanding of men and women being the two genders that we have to work with. And we default to privileging and centering our language around men, right? Another example of this is that if you have a nurse, right? If you're at a healthcare facility and you have a nurse working for you, if it's a woman who's the nurse, you would just probably refer to as a nurse. But if it happened to be a man who was your nurse, you would probably refer to him as a male nurse, right? Because again, in our society, the default expectation is that nursing is a predominantly feminine occupation. So to have a man enter into this feminine workspace, we add in that language distinction to call him a male nurse, to go out of the way to add in that context, right? So it just goes to show you that the language that we use, again, in our society kind of shapes our reality. It shapes our understanding of how we view things, and it also tells us a little bit historically about how our society went about developing the language system that we have. In the context of the US, our language was heavily built around the privileging and centering of men and men's experiences. Right. Another way to look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is to kind of understand that every culture typically has kind of some phrases or some words even that we use and make sense to us, but have absolutely no sensible context to other societies, right? So for example, all of these phrases, it's raining cats and dogs, I'm going to call it a day, I'm going to bite the bullet, you need to just get it out of your system. That was totally out of the blue. That's not really my cup of tea. Or I'm gonna run like the wind, right? These are all common sayings that we use in the United States. But if you are not a native English speaker, especially in the United States, these sayings would make absolutely no sense to you, right? Imagine if you had a foreign exchange student come and stay with your family from a country that does not speak English as their primary language. And one day it started to just pour outside and you said, wow, it's really raining cats and dogs. Think how alarming and bizarre that would sound to someone that's trying to translate, verbatim what you said, perros and gatos falling from the sky. What does that mean? That would be a very bizarre thing to hear if English is not your first language. Of course, when we saying it's raining cats and dogs, we don't literally mean that puppies and kitties are falling from the sky. We just mean that it's raining really heavily, right? But again, that's an Americanized form of their English language that we use here. So the language that we have really shapes our reality. It shapes our way of making sense of the cultures that we're part of, and that is what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis refers to. So every society also has a system of values and beliefs. So values essentially are a culture's standard of deciding what is good and bad from that perspective, from your society's perspective, right? So values and beliefs are largely going to vary from culture to culture. In the United States, one example, we heavily value physical beauty in the United States, right? We do. We're just socialized from many different agents of socialization to view certain physical body features, certain aspects of dress and appearance as being beautiful or more attractive than others, right? So something in our society in US that we value is beauty. We value things that we are socialized to think are very beautiful or physically attractive in our society. Now, a belief is a little different. A belief refers to a specific idea or even an assumption that a society has when we talk about what people think is true in the world, okay? So a belief is just basically an assumption about what any group of people think is true in the world. And again, like values, beliefs are going to vary from one culture to the next. So let's go back to this example. In the United States, we value physical beauty, and we hold the belief, this assumption in our society, that looking younger inherently makes us more beautiful in our society, right? So we value physical beauty, and we have this belief, this assumption that being younger or making yourself look younger makes you look more beautiful, right? Now, it's important to know that while having a shared sense of values and beliefs is a common attribute of cultures and a common attribute of societies, it can create a sense of solidarity, like we talked about Durkheim's functionalist idea of creating a collective consciousness that we all buy into something together. It can make us feel part of something larger than ourselves, which can be good and functional for society as a whole. However, it can also really pressure us to try and fit in if we don't adhere or believe or buy into the values and beliefs that our society and our culture are trying to socialize us into. So an example of this, our society's value of youth and the belief that to look young is to look beautiful can influence a lot of Americans to have cosmetic surgery every year so they can make themselves look younger. In fact, the most popular growing area of surgical procedures in the United States is cosmetic surgery because people want to have facelifts and tummy tucks and breast augmentation, etc., to physically alter their bodies to make them look younger, because in our society we value looking physically attractive and we have this belief that to look younger makes us more attractive. So it's not always that buying into your society's or your culture's values and belief systems is a great thing. Sometimes it can actually cause us to do things that are irrational or even potentially put us in harm's way. But values and beliefs, having a shared system of them, also does produce the sense of collective consciousness, which is important as well. A culture's values can often be difficult to live up to. It's not to say that everyone automatically just falls into place with a culture's values, right? The things that we decide are good and bad in any given society aren't necessarily the practices that we follow. We don't always, for example, practice what we preach. So in the US, again, we may value good health, right? That's something that we value in the United States, to lead a healthy lifestyle. However, a lot of us still enjoy to splurge on Whataburger, or to drink alcohol, or to smoke cigarettes, or do other drugs, or engage in other behaviors that we know are bad for us, even though we still value good health as a culture. Another example, we might value marital monogamy, this idea that if you get married to someone, you should practice or only engage in sexual behavior with that person. However, we still know that a large percentage of married people end up cheating or having an affair on their significant other. So we might value certain practices in our society, but we don't always necessarily practice those values.